The silver moon hung heavy over Crescent Falls, casting long shadows through the forest, where most of my kind would be running free, their wolves finally unleashed after another day of pretending to be human. I sat on the porch of my grandmother's cabin, watching the tree line for movement I would never join, listening for howls I would never voice. At 23, I was the only werewolf in 3 territories who had never shifted. Not once, not even during my first full moon. At 13, when every wolf was supposed to find their other half for the first time. My fingers traced the worn wood of the railing, feeling the grooves left by my grandmother's claws during her own restless nights. She'd understood what it meant to be different, though her difference had been power, not its absence. Mine was something else, entirely something, that made the council nervous and other wolves whisper behind cupped hands when they thought I couldn't hear. The sound of approaching footsteps made me tense, my enhanced hearing picking up the deliberate cadence of someone trying not to startle me. Most wolves moved with unconscious grace, but this person was being careful, almost reverent in their approach. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Marcus Chen had been my closest friend since childhood, back when being wolfless had seemed like a temporary problem rather than a permanent condition. "The Riverside Pack is sending another delegation tomorrow," he said, without preamble, settling beside me on the steps. His warmth was comforting in the way that only an old friend's presence could be, tinged with the earthy scent that all wolves carried, but somehow uniquely his own. Word is, they're bringing their new alpha this time. I finally looked at him, noting the concern that creased his dark eyes. Marcus had always been handsome in an understated way, with the kind of steady presence that made others feel safe. He'd been offered positions in 6 packs over the years, but he'd always declined, choosing instead to stay in our small border community where misfits and outcasts could exist without judgment. How new are we talking? Took over 3 months ago when his father stepped down. Apparently, he's young, ambitious, and very interested in our little anomaly. Marcus's voice carried that careful neutrality he used when discussing the political implications of my existence. His name is Riverstone, and according to my sources, he's already made contact with the other packs that have sent representatives. The other packs. Over the past year, word had somehow spread about what happened when I was near dominant wolves. It had started small visiting alphas mentioning that they felt stronger, more focused during their brief stops in our territory. Then, the reports had grown more detailed, more concerning. Alphas experiencing power surges that lasted for weeks after encountering me. Betas suddenly showing alpha-level abilities. The carefully maintained hierarchy of werewolf society beginning to show cracks wherever I went. "What does he want?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. They all wanted the same thing to understand how someone who couldn't even shift could somehow amplify the abilities of others. To find a way to bottle whatever strange magic flowed through my veins and use it for their own purposes. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the forest where other wolves were living the life I'd never have. Same as the others, most likely. But Naya... He turned to me, using the name my grandmother had given me, one that meant flow in the old tongue, though she'd never explained why she'd chosen it. "There's something else. The council is getting pressure to make a decision about you." My stomach dropped. The Council of Alphas governed all werewolf territories on the continent. maintaining the delicate balance between packs and ensuring that our secret world remained hidden from humans. They'd been aware of my situation since I was 16, when the first reports of my effect on other wolves had reached their attention. For 7 years, they'd been content to monitor and wait, hoping I'd either develop normal abilities or that my influence would prove benign. "What kind of decision?" I asked, though the tremor in my voice betrayed that I already feared the worst. "Containment," Marcus said quietly. "There's a facility in the Northern Territories where they study supernatural anomalies. It's not a prison, exactly, but—" He didn't need to finish. We both knew that a cage was still a cage, regardless of how comfortable they made it. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my entire life feeling trapped by my inability to shift, to access the other half of my soul that every werewolf was supposed to possess. Now they wanted to physically trap me because of abilities I couldn't control or understand. "How long do I have?" "The vote is scheduled for the winter solstice. 2 months. Marcus reached over and took my hand, his calloused fingers warm against my palm. "But Naya, if this new alpha is different somehow, if he can help us understand what's happening to you—" I pulled my hand away, standing abruptly and pacing to the edge of the porch. "You mean if he can find a way to use me more effectively than the others?" The bitterness in my voice surprised even me, but I was tired of being treated like a resource to be managed, rather than a person with agency. "Every alpha who's come here has left with enhanced abilities that fade over time. They all want to know how to make it permanent, how to manufacture it. None of them care about what it costs me." "What does it cost you?" "You," Marcus asked gently. It was a question he'd posed before, one I'd never been able to answer satisfactorily, because I didn't fully understand it myself. I turned back to him, seeing the genuine concern in his expression. Marcus had been there for every supernatural delegation, every test and examination I'd endured. He'd seen the exhaustion that followed each encounter, the way I seemed to dim slightly after every alpha left our territory with borrowed power. "I don't know," I admitted. "But something. It always feels like something." Before Marcus could respond, the wind shifted, carrying with it a scent that made every nerve in my body come alive. Wolf, definitely, but unlike any I'd encountered before. Where most wolves smelled of earth and forest, of the wildness they carried within them, this scent was like a storm front electric and dangerous, full of barely contained power. My skin began to tingle, a warmth spreading through my chest that I'd learned to associate with the proximity of an alpha. But this was different, stronger, more immediate. Marcus tensed beside me, his nostrils flaring as he caught the same scent. "That's impossible," he murmured. "They're not supposed to arrive until tomorrow." The forest at the edge of our property rustled, and then he stepped into the moonlight, and I understood why every instinct I possessed was screaming warnings. Riverstone was tall and lean, with the kind of predatory grace that marked apex predators in any species. His dark hair caught the silver light, and even from a distance, I could see the intensity of his gaze as it locked onto mine. But it was the power rolling off him in waves that took my breath away, raw, untamed authority that spoke to something deep in my wolf soul, the part of me that had never fully awakened, but somehow still recognized its better. "Naya Thorn," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between us. It was rich and deep, with an undertone that made my skin prickle with awareness. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." He moved closer, each step deliberate and measured, and I felt that familiar stirring in my chest intensify. But where previous encounters with alphas had been like a gentle warmth spreading through my system, this was like touching a live wire. Energy crackled between us, and I saw his eyes flash gold for just a moment before he regained control. "You're early," Marcus said, rising to his feet and positioning himself slightly in front of me. It was a protective gesture that would have been sweet if it weren't completely unnecessary and potentially dangerous. I'd learned over the years that getting between me and an alpha during one of these episodes was a bad idea for everyone involved. River's gaze flicked to Marcus, and I saw something predatory flash across his features before he controlled it. "I wanted to meet her before the formal proceedings tomorrow, away from the politics and posturing." His attention returned to me, and I felt pinned by the intensity of his stare. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" I asked, finding my voice despite the chaos my nervous system was experiencing. Every alpha who came here seemed to have preconceived notions about what I should be, some mystical figure or dangerous weapon. The reality of a woman who couldn't even shift was always a disappointment. "Someone broken," he said honestly, and the bluntness of it caught me off guard. "The reports made it sound like you were damaged, incomplete. But you're not, are you? You're something else entirely." Before I could ask what he meant, his control slipped again, and I felt the full force of his alpha presence slam into me. It should have driven me to my knees, should have triggered every submission instinct werewolves possessed. Instead, something in my chest unfurled like a flower opening to sunlight, and suddenly the power flowing between us doubled. River staggered, his eyes going wide with shock as his own abilities reflected back to him amplified. For a moment, his human facade cracked completely, revealing the wolf beneath ancient and powerful and utterly wild. His hands shifted, claws extending briefly before he forced them back to human form. "What the hell?" he breathed, and there was wonder in his voice, along with the confusion. Marcus stepped forward, concern radiating from him. "Naya, you need to step back." But I couldn't move, caught in the strange feedback loop that had formed between River and me. I could feel his wolf, could sense the depth of power that he carried, and somehow I knew that he could feel something in me as well, not the absence that everyone else perceived, but a presence that was vast and unnamed. "No," River said sharply, his voice carrying enough command to make Marcus freeze mid-step. "Don't interfere." His gaze never left mine, and I saw recognition dawning in his expression. "You're not enhancing my abilities. You're awakening something that was already there." The distinction felt important, though I wasn't sure why. "I don't understand." "Neither do I," he admitted, taking another step closer, despite the obvious strain it was causing both of us. "But I don't think anyone else has understood either. They've been looking at this all wrong, haven't they? Treating you like you're somehow defective when you're actually—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I need to think about this." The connection between us snapped suddenly, leaving me cold and somehow bereft. River took several steps back, his breathing rough, as he struggled to regain his equilibrium. When he looked at me again, his expression was unreadable. "The council thinks you're dangerous," he said quietly. "But I don't think they understand what kind of danger you represent." "What do you mean?" I asked, wrapping my arms around myself against the chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "I mean that what just happened between us shouldn't be possible, not for someone who's supposed to be wolfless." His gaze was calculating now, the mind of an alpha working through implications and possibilities. "Tomorrow, during the formal meeting, they're going to want to run tests, standard procedure for supernatural anomalies." Marcus made a sound of protest. "She's not a lab rat to be experimented on." "No," River agreed, surprising us both. "She's not. Which is why I'm going to recommend that the council table their decision pending further investigation." Hope flared in my chest, quickly followed by suspicion. "What's the catch?" River smiled, and there was something almost predatory in the expression. "You come with me, to my territory, where I can figure out what you are and how to protect you from the council's more permanent solutions." "Absolutely not," Marcus said immediately. "Naya isn't going anywhere with an alpha she just met, especially not one who's clearly affected by whatever it is she does to your kind." "What I am," River said, his voice dropping to that dangerous register that made my pulse quicken, "is the only thing standing between her and a lifetime of captivity. The council's patience is running out, and the other alphas who've encountered her are starting to demand answers. If she stays here, they'll take her whether she wants to go or not." The worst part was that he was right. I'd known this day was coming, had felt the walls closing in as more and more supernatural politics intruded on our quiet border community. But the idea of leaving everything I'd ever known, of trusting my safety to an alpha whose own control seemed questionable around me, was terrifying. "I need time to think," I said finally. River nodded, though I could see the impatience in his stance. "You have until tomorrow night. After the council meeting, things are going to move quickly, whether we're ready or not." He turned to go, then paused and looked back at me. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're broken. I think you're something that's never existed before, and that scares them. It should scare you too, but not for the reasons they think." With that cryptic statement, he melted back into the forest, leaving Marcus and me alone with the lingering scent of storm and possibility. "This is insane," Marcus said as soon as River was gone. "You can't seriously be considering going with him?" I sank back down onto the porch steps, suddenly exhausted. "What choice do I have? You said it yourself, the council is going to vote to contain me. At least this way, I have some agency in what happens next. You don't know anything about him, about his pack or his intentions." Marcus sat beside me again, and I could feel the worry radiating from him. What if he's just as interested in using your abilities as the others were? It was a valid concern, one that had occurred to me as well. But there had been something different about River's reaction to our connection, something that felt less exploitative and more curious, like he was trying to solve a puzzle rather than extract a resource. "Then I'll deal with that when it happens," I said. "But Marcus, if I stay here, we both know how this ends. They'll take me to their facility, they'll run their tests, and eventually they'll decide I'm too dangerous to leave free. At least with River, there's a chance I can find out what I actually am before someone else makes that decision for me." Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring out at the forest where other wolves were living freely. Finally, he sighed. "If you go with him, I'm coming too." "Marcus, no. You have a life here, responsibilities." "My responsibility is to you," he said firmly. "Has been, since we were kids, and you were trying to figure out why you were different from everyone else. I'm not abandoning you now." The loyalty in his voice made my chest tight with emotion. Marcus had given up so much over the years to stay by my side, turning down pack positions and potential mates to help me navigate a world that didn't quite know what to do with me. I couldn't ask him to sacrifice more. "We'll see what tomorrow brings," I said instead, not wanting to fight about it when there were so many other uncertainties ahead of us. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, matching my mood as I prepared for what would likely be the most important meeting of my life. The council had sent a 3-member delegation to conduct their formal assessment to alphas I'd never met, and a beta who specialized in supernatural anomalies. River would be there as well, representing the interests of his pack, though I wasn't entirely sure what those interests were yet. I dressed carefully in dark jeans and a forest green sweater that my grandmother had knitted years ago, hoping the familiar comfort of her work would help steady my nerves. Marcus had arrived early, bringing coffee and pastries from the local bakery as if this were a social occasion rather than a potential sentencing hearing. "Any word from your contact about how these things usually go?" I asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. Marcus shook his head. "Council assessments are typically closed proceedings. But from what I understand, they'll want to document your abilities, run some basic tests, and then make their recommendation to the full council." "Tests like what?" "Physical examination, blood work, maybe some exposure to different supernatural stimuli to measure your responses." He paused, then added more gently, "They'll also want to see your effect on other wolves firsthand." Of course they would. I'd known that was coming. But it didn't make the prospect any less uncomfortable. Being studied like a laboratory specimen while my abilities did things to other wolves that I couldn't control or understand was not high on my list of enjoyable activities. The sound of multiple vehicles approaching made us both tense. Through the window, I could see a small convoy pulling up to the cabin. 2 official council cars with tinted windows and River's truck bringing up the rear. My heart rate spiked as I watched the occupants emerge, each one radiating the kind of supernatural authority that made my skin prickle with awareness. The lead council representative was a woman who looked to be in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of commanding presence that spoke of decades in leadership. Her companion was younger, maybe 40, with the restless energy of someone who wasn't comfortable being away from his own territory. The beta was harder to read, his mild appearance concealing whatever specialized knowledge had earned him a place on this delegation. River emerged from his truck last, and even at a distance, I could feel the pull between us, re-establishing itself. He'd changed. Since last night, gone was the casual attire, replaced by the formal black clothing that pack leaders wore to official functions. But his gaze found mine immediately, and I saw something that might have been reassurance in his expression. "Ready?" Marcus asked quietly. "As ready as anyone could be for having their entire future decided by strangers, I supposed. Let's get this over with." The council representatives had set up a temporary meeting space in our community centre, a modest building that usually hosted local events and pack gatherings. They'd arranged the furniture to create a formal fall seating area, with chairs positioned to make it clear who was being evaluated and who was doing the evaluating. Naya Thorne, the lead representative said as I entered, her voice carrying the kind of authority that demanded attention. I'm Alpha Catherine Winters of the Northern Territories Council. This is Alpha James Harrison from the Eastern Coalition, and Dr. Miles Chen, our supernatural phenomena specialist. I noticed that River positioned himself slightly apart from the council delegation, making it clear that while he was participating in the proceedings, he wasn't necessarily aligned with their agenda. It was a subtle political distinction that probably meant more than I understood. Please, have a seat, Alpha Winters continued, gesturing to a chair that had obviously been placed to put me at the center of attention. We appreciate you agreeing to this assessment. As if I'd had much choice in the matter, but I kept that observation to myself, settling into the indicated chair and trying to project more confidence than I felt. Marcus took a seat nearby, close enough to offer support, but far enough away to avoid interfering with whatever tests they had planned. Let's start with some basic information, Dr. Chen said, consulting a tablet that presumably contained my file. You're 23 years old, born to Rebecca Thorne and an unknown father. You've never experienced a first shift, show no signs of wolf transformation, and have no documented supernatural abilities. Is that accurate? Mostly, I said carefully, though I'd argue that affecting other wolves' abilities counts as a supernatural ability, even if we don't understand how it works. Alpha Harrison leaned forward slightly. Tell us about that. In your own words, describe what happens when you encounter other dominant wolves. It was a question I'd answered dozens of times over the years, but never in such a formal setting. There's a connection that forms. I can feel their power, and somehow mine responds to it. The Alpha experiences an enhancement of their abilities that can last for weeks or months after the encounter. And how does it affect you? Dr. Chen asked. That was the harder question, the one I'd never been able to answer completely. It's draining. Not immediately, but over time. Like something is being drawn out of me and not fully replenishing. River stirred at that, and I saw him exchange a look with Alpha Winters that I couldn't interpret. Whatever he'd learned about my situation since last night, he hadn't shared it with the council yet. We'd like to run some tests, Alpha Winters said. Nothing invasive, just some basic measurements and observations. Dr. Chen has some equipment that can monitor supernatural energy fluctuations. I nodded, having expected this part of the process. Dr. Chen produced several devices that looked like crosses between medical equipment and something from a science fiction movie, attaching sensors to my wrists and temples with practiced efficiency. These will monitor your biorhythms and energy output, he explained. We'll take baseline measurements first, then introduce some controlled stimuli to see how you respond. The controlled stimuli, it turned out, were the other alphas in the room. Over the next hour, I was subjected to measured exposures to their power Alpha Harrison first, then Alpha Winters. Each encounter, carefully documented and analysed, the familiar sensations of connection and amplification played out exactly as they had dozens of times before, though the clinical setting made everything feel more invasive and uncomfortable. Fascinating, Dr. Chen murmured, reviewing the data streaming across his devices. The energy patterns are unlike anything I've documented before. There's definitely an exchange happening, but it's not following any known supernatural paradigm. What does that mean? I asked. It means, Alpha Winters said slowly, that we're dealing with something entirely unprecedented, which makes our decision about how to proceed even more complex. River had remained silent throughout the testing, but now he stood and moved closer to where I sat bristling with monitoring equipment. With your permission, I'd like to try something. Alpha Winters frowned. This is a formal assessment, Alpha Stone. Personal experiments aren't part of the protocol. What I experienced last night was different from what we've seen here today, River said calmly. If we're going to make an informed decision about Naya's future, shouldn't we document all the possibilities? The council representatives exchanged glances, and I could practically see them weighing political considerations against scientific curiosity. Finally, Alpha Winters nodded. Proceed, but carefully. We don't want to damage our equipment. River approached me slowly, and I could feel that electric awareness building between us again. But instead of simply projecting his alpha presence like the others had done, he did something different. He reached out with his power carefully, almost gently, like he was offering rather than commanding. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Instead of the measured amplification I'd experienced with the other alphas, something in my chest exploded outward like a dam bursting. Energy poured between us in a feedback loop that grew stronger by the second, and I felt something that had been sleeping in my soul suddenly roar to life. Doctor. Chen's equipment went haywire. Alarms beeping frantically as readings spiked beyond their measurement capabilities. But I barely noticed, caught up in the sensation of finally feeling complete. For just a moment, I could sense the wolf that had always been missing, could feel the other half of my soul, stretching and awakening. Then River stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock, and the connection shattered. The sudden absence left me gasping, feeling more hollow than I had before. What the hell was that? Alpha Harrison demanded, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. River was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. She's not wolfless, he said quietly. She's something else entirely. Something that's been contained or suppressed, and I think I know why. Before anyone could respond, he moved forward again. But this time his approach was completely different. Instead of projecting dominance, he offered submission not to me, but to whatever power he'd sensed sleeping inside me. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. Energy exploded outward from me in all directions, and every wolf in the room dropped to their knees as primal instincts overrode their conscious minds. Even Marcus, who had never shown submission to anyone, found himself bowing under the weight of whatever had just awakened. For one impossible moment, I felt what it was like to be not just an alpha, but something beyond that hierarchy entirely. Something that commanded even the commanders. Then the power vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving me trembling and confused in a room full of equally shaken werewolves. What am I? I whispered, though I wasn't sure anyone was in a state to answer. River was the first to recover, pushing himself back to his feet with obvious effort. When he looked at me, there was something that might have been awe in his expression. I think, he said carefully, you might be what we've been waiting for, without knowing it. The silence that followed was heavy with implications I didn't understand. Whatever had just happened, it had changed everything. The question now was whether that change would save me or condemn me. Alpha Winters was the next to recover, though she remained seated and kept her gaze averted from mine. Doctor, Chen, please tell me you recorded that. The beta was frantically checking his equipment, most of which appeared to have overloaded during my power surge. Some of it, but most of the readings are off the scale. I've never seen energy signatures like these. Because they don't exist, River said, his voice carrying a certainty that made me turn to him. What we just witnessed wasn't the result of Naya being broken or incomplete. It was the result of something incredibly powerful being held in check. By what? Alpha Harrison asked, though he still hadn't tried to stand. River's gaze met mine, and I saw knowledge there that he hadn't possessed an hour ago. By her own nature. She's not failing to shift because she lacks a wolf. She's failing to shift because her wolf is too powerful to be contained in a normal werewolf form. The implications of that statement hung in the air like a challenge. If River was right, then everything the supernatural community thought they knew about me was wrong. I wasn't a defective werewolf. I was something else entirely, something that had been hiding its true nature even from itself. That's impossible, Dr. Chen said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Power like that would manifest from childhood. We would have seen signs. We did see signs, River interrupted. Every alpha who encountered her experienced power amplification. Every encounter left her drained. She's been unconsciously sharing her abilities her entire life because her wolf knew they were too much for her human form to handle alone. Alpha Winters finally looked up at me, and I saw wariness mixed with something that might have been respect. If what you're suggesting is accurate, Alpha Stone, then we're not dealing with an anomaly to be contained. We're dealing with a true alpha, River finished. The first one born in over a century. The term meant something to them that it didn't to me, judging by the way everyone in the room reacted. Marcus looked stunned. Dr. Chen appeared to be having some kind of academic crisis, and both Council Alphas seemed torn between fascination and fear. What's a true alpha? I asked, though part of me suspected I didn't want to know the answer. A werewolf whose power doesn't come from pack hierarchy or territorial dominance. River explained. True alphas derive their authority from something deeper, from the very essence of what it means to be wolf. They're born to lead not just packs, but entire species. The last documented true alpha was over 100 years ago, Alpha Winters added quietly. She united the werewolf clans during the Great War, established the council system we still use today, and then disappeared into legend. What happened to her? I asked. No one knows for certain. Some say she transcended physical form entirely. Others believe she chose to suppress her abilities to live a normal life. River's expression was thoughtful. But if that's what happened, it would explain why her bloodline seemed to vanish. Maybe it didn't. Vanish, maybe it went dormant, waiting for the right circumstances to reawaken. The pieces were starting to come together in a way that was both terrifying and oddly relieving. If River was right, then my inability to shift wasn't a failure. It was a protective mechanism. My wolf had been too powerful to emerge safely, so it had remained hidden, sharing just enough of its abilities with others to prevent a dangerous cat. Build-up of power. This changes everything, Alpha Harrison said, finally managing to stand, though he kept his distance from me. The council will need to convene an emergency session. If we truly have a true alpha among us, then the supernatural world is about to change whether we're ready for it or not, River finished. Which brings us back to the original question of what to do with Naya. All eyes turned to me, and I felt the weight of their expectations like a physical pressure. These people wanted me to be something I didn't understand, to accept responsibilities I'd never asked for. But the alternative being locked away in a council facility while they tried to study abilities I couldn't control was even worse. I need time, I said finally, to understand what this means, to learn how to control whatever is happening to me. The council facility isn't going to provide that. No, Alpha Winters agreed. It's not. A true alpha requires different handling entirely. She looked at River with an expression I couldn't read. Your offer to take her into your territory, is it still open? More than open, River said immediately, but the terms have changed. I'm not taking in a supernatural anomaly who needs protection. I'm allying myself with someone who could reshape the entire werewolf political landscape. The distinction was important, though I wasn't entirely sure why yet. Political alliances implied equality and mutual benefit, while protection suggested hierarchy and dependence. If I was going to figure out what I was and how to control it, I needed to be treated as a partner, not a patient. What would that alliance look like? I asked. River considered the question seriously. You come to my territory as an honored guest, not a refugee. You train with my pack specialists to understand and control your abilities. In exchange, you help us strengthen our defenses and prepare for whatever political changes your emergence might trigger. It was a fair offer, more generous than I'd expected. But there was something in River's tone that suggested he wasn't telling me everything. And what aren't you mentioning? A smile flickered across his face, gone too quickly to interpret. Smart question. The truth is, having a true alpha allied with my pack would significantly increase our standing in supernatural politics. There are other packs older, more established ones who haven't been particularly friendly to new leadership. Your presence would make them think twice about any aggressive moves. At least he was being honest about the political benefits. I could respect that more than I could false altruism. And if I decide I don't want to be anyone's political advantage, then you're free to leave at any time, River said simply. A true alpha can't be held against their will, not by any power we possess. Alpha Winters cleared her throat. The council will need to vote on this arrangement. An alliance between a true alpha and a territorial pack isn't something we can authorize unilaterally. With respect, River said, though his tone suggested he felt no particular respect for the council's authority at that moment. A true alpha doesn't require council authorization for their decisions. That's rather the point of being a true alpha. The political tension in the room was thick enough to cut, but I found myself oddly calm despite being at the center of it. Whatever I was, what other power had awakened in me during that strange connection with River, it came with a confidence I'd never possessed before. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere in the supernatural hierarchy. I'll go with River, I decided, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. But not as a refugee, or even as an ally. I'm going as someone who needs to understand herself, and I expect to be treated accordingly. River nodded, and I saw approval in his expression. Agreed. When would you like to leave? Tonight, I said, ignoring Marcus's sharp intake of breath. If the council is going to vote on my future, I'd rather not be here when they do it. Naya, Marcus said quietly, are you sure about this? I turned to him. Seeing the concern and worry in his familiar features. Marcus had been my anchor for so many years, the one constant in a life full of questions and uncertainties. But I couldn't ask him to follow me into whatever came next, especially when I didn't know what that might involve. "I'm sure," I said gently. "But, Marcus, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted. "If you're really a true alpha, then you're going to need someone you trust completely. Someone who knew you before you had power, who can remind you who you are, if you ever lose sight of it." River looked between us, and something shifted in his expression. "Your friend is welcome in my territory, but he should understand that pack dynamics are different from border community life. There will be expectations and hierarchies to navigate." "I can handle pack politics," Marcus said dryly. "I've been watching other wolves play dominance games my entire life." "Good," River said, though I caught a note of something else in his voice, not quite jealousy, but definitely a heightened awareness of Marcus that hadn't been there before. "Then we should make preparations to leave. The sooner Naya is away from here, the better. Other packs are going to hear about what happened today, and not all of them will be pleased about the emergence of a true alpha." That was a sobering thought. I'd been so focused on the Council's reaction that I hadn't considered how other supernatural leaders might respond to my existence. If true alphas were as powerful as River suggested, my presence would disrupt established power structures across multiple territories. "What kind of problems are we talking about?" I asked. "The kind that lead to challenges and territorial disputes," River said grimly. "Some alphas won't accept the legitimacy of a true alpha, especially one who's been unknown for so long. They'll want to test your power, to see if you're really what you claim to be. And if they find out I don't know how to control whatever I am?" River's expression was serious. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But Naya, what occurred here today wasn't an accident or a fluke. That power came from somewhere deep inside you, and it responded to a specific trigger. We need to figure out what that trigger was and how to access it safely." He was right, though the idea of deliberately triggering something that had knocked every wolf in the room to their knees was terrifying. But the alternative, living in ignorance while other packs tested my defenses, was even worse. "How long will it take to reach your territory?" I asked. 6 hours by car, less if we push it," River replied. "My pack lands are in the Cascade Mountains, far enough from major population centers to provide privacy for training." Alpha Winters stood, her movement careful and deliberate. "I'll need to report what happened here to the full council within 24 hours. That gives you a small head start before the political machinery starts moving." "Appreciated," River said with a nod that managed to be both respectful and dismissive. Dr. Chen was still fussing with his damaged equipment, muttering about unprecedented energy readings and theoretical impossibilities. "I don't suppose you'd be willing to submit to further testing once you're settled?" he asked hopefully. "That depends on whether the testing is designed to help me understand my abilities or to find ways to suppress them," I said. The distinction felt important, though I wasn't entirely sure why. "Understanding," he said quickly. "Definitely understanding. What happened here today challenges everything we thought we knew about werewolf genetics and power inheritance. If we could document the process of the true alpha coming into their abilities, we'll be in touch," River said, effectively ending the conversation. "But any future testing will be on our terms, in our territory," With our safety protocols, the possessive pronoun wasn't lost on me, though I chose not to comment on it. River's protective instincts were probably going to be an issue at some point, but I had bigger concerns at the moment. The council representatives gathered their equipment and prepared to leave, though Alpha Winters paused at the door. Naya, I want you to understand something. What you are, what you represent, it's going to change things for all of us. The last true Alpha reshaped werewolf society in ways that lasted for generations. Your emergence suggests that another transformation is coming, whether we're ready for it or not. What if I don't want that responsibility? I asked. Alpha Winters smiled, and for the first time, there was warmth in her expression. Then you're probably exactly the right person for it. Power wielded reluctantly is often power wielded wisely. After the council delegation left, I found myself alone with Marcus and River in the suddenly too quiet community centre. The weight of what had just transpired was settling over me like a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe. Are you okay? Marcus asked, moving to stand beside me. I don't know, I admitted. An hour ago, I thought I was a defective werewolf facing forced containment. Now, I'm apparently some kind of legendary figure with world-changing potential. It's a lot to process. River had been silent since the others left, but now he approached us with that careful, predatory grace that marked him as definitely more than human. The processing can happen on the road. Right now, we need to focus on getting you somewhere safe. Define safe, I said. Because if other packs are going to challenge me, nowhere is really safe, is it? Safe enough, River replied. My territory is well defended, and my pack is loyal. We'll have time to figure out your abilities before anyone tries to test them. There was something in his tone that made me study his face more carefully. You're not telling me something. What is it? River glanced at Marcus, then back at me. The connection between us, what happened last night, and again today, that's not normal either. True alphas don't typically form instantaneous bonds with territorial leaders. What kind of bonds? Marcus asked sharply, and I could hear the concern in his voice. The kind that suggest a deeper compatibility than simple political alliance, River said carefully. True alphas, throughout history, have had specific requirements for their inner circles. They couldn't work with just anyone. The power differential was too great. They needed partners who could handle their energy without being overwhelmed by it. The implications of what he was saying hit me like a physical blow. You think we're mates? I think it's a possibility we should consider, River said. The alternative is that what happened between us was a fluke, and I don't think either of us believes that. Marcus made a sound of protest. Naya, you've known him for less than 24 hours. Whatever connection you're feeling could be a result of your power awakening, not some mystical mate bond. He was right to be concerned. The idea of being mated to someone I barely knew was terrifying, especially when that someone seemed to have his own political agenda. But I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward River, the sense of completion that had accompanied our connection. It doesn't matter right now, I said finally. Whether we're mates or just compatible, River's territory is still my best option for figuring out what I am. We can deal with the rest later. River nodded, though I saw something that might have been disappointment flicker across his features. Agreed. The immediate priority is getting you to safety and beginning your training. What kind of training? I asked. Control exercises, meditation techniques, supervised power manifestations. River listed. My pack has specialists who work with newly shifted wolves and those with unusual abilities. They'll be able to help you understand and channel what you're experiencing. It sounded reasonable, though I suspected the reality would be more complicated than he was making it sound. But I was committed now, for better or worse. The next few hours passed in a blur of packing and preparation. I gathered what few possessions seemed worth, taking mostly clothes and a few mementos. From my grandmother, while Marcus made arrangements for his own temporary absence from the community, River disappeared for a while to make phone calls and coordinate our travel, returning with a grim expression that suggested not all of his conversations had gone well. Problem? I asked as we loaded the last of our belongings into his truck. Minor one, River said, though his tone suggested it was anything but minor. Word about today's events has already started spreading. My beta has fielded 3 calls from other pack leaders, asking about our new acquisition. Acquisition? Marcus said sharply. Their term, not mine, River replied. But it gives you an idea of how some of the older packs view supernatural anomalies. They see resources to be claimed, rather than people to be respected. And what did your beta tell them? I asked. River's smile was sharp and predatory, that the Cascade Mountain Pack has entered into an alliance with a true alpha, and that any attempts to interfere with that alliance would be considered acts of aggression. It was a strong statement, one that would undoubtedly have political ramifications. I found myself both grateful for his protection and concerned about the enemies he might be making on my behalf. Will that be enough to keep them away? I asked. For now, River said. But Naya, I need you to understand something. Once we reach my territory, you're going to be under constant scrutiny. Every pack member will be watching to see how you handle yourself. Every rival will be looking for signs of weakness. You'll need to project confidence even when you don't feel it. The pressure was already starting to build, the weight of expectations I'd never asked for, but I'd made my choice, and I was going to see it through. I can handle scrutiny, I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. River studied my face for a moment, then nodded. I believe you can. But remember, you're not alone in this. My pack will support you, and I'll be there every step of the way. The possessive undertone was back, and I saw Marcus tense slightly at the implication. The dynamic between the 2 men was going to be complicated, especially if River was right about the mate bond. But that was a problem for another day. We left Crescent Falls as the sun was setting, the familiar landscape of my childhood disappearing in the rearview mirror. I'd lived my entire life in that small border community, surrounded by people who'd accepted my differences without fully understanding them. Now, I was heading into the unknown, armed with abilities I couldn't control and responsibilities I'd never wanted. But for the first time in my life, I also felt like I was moving toward something rather than away from it. Whatever awaited me in River's territory, whatever challenges and discoveries lay ahead, I would face them as myself, not as a broken werewolf, or a dangerous anomaly, but as something entirely new. The road stretched ahead through darkening forest, carrying us toward a future that was as uncertain as it was inevitable. Behind us, the council would be voting on what to do about a true alpha who had already made her own decision. Ahead, River's pack waited to judge whether I was worthy of the power I'd never asked for. And somewhere deep inside me, Something ancient and powerful stirred, preparing for whatever came next. The drive to River's territory passed mostly in contemplative silence, broken only by occasional navigation discussions and Marcus's pointed questions about pack structure and hierarchy. River answered them with the patience of someone who understood that trust had to be earned, especially when it came to someone as protective of me as Marcus clearly was. As we climbed higher into the Cascade Mountains, the air grew thinner and the forest more dense. These were old mountains, covered in trees that had been growing for centuries, and I could feel the weight of their age pressing against my consciousness. It was different from the border community's newer growth. This felt ancient, primal, like a place where the old powers still held sway. How much farther? I asked as we navigated another winding mountain road. About an hour, River replied. The packlands are deep in the wilderness, away from human eyes and ears. We value our privacy. That privacy was about to be tested, I realized. My presence would bring attention to his pack, whether he wanted it or not. Other alphas would come calling. The council would want to monitor the situation, and there was no telling what other supernatural entities might take an interest in a newly awakened true alpha. River, I said carefully, what you're doing for me, taking me in despite the political complications, why? What do you really get out of this arrangement? He was quiet for a long moment, his hands steady on the steering wheel as he navigated a particularly sharp curve. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure yet. When I first heard about you, it was simple curiosity. A werewolf who could enhance other wolves' abilities was interesting from a tactical standpoint. But after yesterday, after feeling what you really are, he glanced at me in the rearview mirror. I think you're going to change everything. And I'd rather be part of that change than trying to stand against it. It was a pragmatic answer, one that made more sense than simple altruism would have. River was young for an alpha, probably only a few years older than me. And his pack was relatively new to these territories. Aligning himself with a true alpha could elevate his standing significantly if he could help me survive long enough to master my abilities. And if I turn out to be more trouble than I'm worth? I asked. River's eyes met mine in the mirror, and I saw something fierce and determined in his gaze. Then we'll deal with that too. But, Naya, I don't think you understand what happened today. What you did, the power you manifested, that wasn't the result of stress or fear. That was you finally starting to wake up. The certainty in his voice was both comforting and terrifying. If he was right, then what I'd experienced today was just the beginning. The full extent of true alpha abilities was still unknown, still developing. I could become something wonderful or something catastrophic, and there was no way to predict which. We finally arrived at the packlands just after midnight, turning off the main road onto a private drive that wound through miles of protected forest. No signs marked the boundary, but I could feel the moment we crossed into pack territory. The air itself seemed to thrum with contained power, and my skin prickled with awareness of the wolves who called this place home. The pack house was larger than I'd expected, a sprawling log structure that managed to look both rustic and sophisticated. Warm light spilled from the windows, and I could see figures moving inside, preparing for our arrival. Your pack is still awake? Marcus asked, checking his watch. I called ahead, River said. They wanted to meet you tonight rather than waiting until morning. Pack introductions are something of a ritual at better, to get them over with while everyone's curious rather than nervous. That made sense. Though I was exhausted from the day's revelations and not particularly eager to make first impressions on a group of werewolves who would be judging my worthiness to live among them. But River was right. Better to face their scrutiny now, while the memory of my power display was still fresh, than to give them time to develop doubts. As we climbed out of the truck, the pack house door opened and several figures emerged onto the wide front porch, even in human form. They moved with the fluid grace that marked experienced shapeshifters, and I could feel their combined attention like a physical weight. "Breed," River said quietly, moving to stand beside me. "They're curious, not hostile. Most of them have never encountered anyone with abilities like yours. Most of them," which implied that some had. A detail I filed away for later consideration. The pack approached us in a loose formation that managed to seem casual while still clearly establishing hierarchy. River's beta was easy to identify, a woman in her 30s with dark hair and the kind of controlled composure that spoke of significant responsibility. Behind her came what I assumed were the pack's other ranking members, each one radiating their own particular blend of power and personality. "Everyone," River said formally, "I'd like you to meet Naya Thorne and Marcus Chen. Naya, this is my beta, Luna Redwood, and my third, David Sterling." Luna stepped forward first, offering her hand in a gesture that was both greeting and subtle test. When I took it, I felt a brief flicker of power exchange between us, nothing like what happened with River, but enough to confirm that my abilities worked with other wolves as well, just to a lesser degree. "Welcome to Cascade Mountain Pack lands," Luna said, her voice warm but assessing. "We've heard quite a bit about you." "I'm sure you have," I replied, trying to project confidence despite my exhaustion, though I suspect most of what you've heard doesn't quite match the reality. Luna smiled at that, and I saw approval in her expression. Reality is often more interesting than rumors. We're looking forward to getting to know the person behind the reputation. David Sterling was next, a man who looked to be in his early 40s, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of a life spent outdoors. His handshake was firm and brief, but I caught a flicker of something recognition in his eyes before he stepped back. David used to work with the Council's Supernatural Research Division, River explained, and suddenly that recognition made sense. He's the one who'll be helping you understand and develop your abilities. "Assuming you're willing to work with someone who's seen his share of unusual cases," David added with a slight smile. "Though I'll admit, true alphas are outside my previous experience." "Previous experience with what?" I asked. "Psychic wolves, elemental shifters, a few cases of inherited magical abilities," David listed casually. "Nothing quite like what you demonstrated today, but similar principles of power management and control." It was reassuring to know that I wouldn't be completely starting from scratch. If David had experience with supernatural anomalies, he might actually be able to help me figure out what I was and how to manage it safely. The rest of the pack introductions followed a similar pattern, formal courtesy mixed with genuine curiosity and carefully concealed assessment. I met the pack's enforcers, their healer, several younger members who seemed torn between fascination and intimidation, and a handful of others whose roles weren't immediately clear, but who obviously held significant positions in the pack hierarchy. Through it all, I was conscious of the careful balance River was maintaining. He stood close enough to offer support and protection, but not so close as to suggest I needed constant oversight. His pack was clearly devoted to him, but they were also forming their own opinions about me based on our interactions. "How are you holding up?" Marcus asked quietly during a brief lull in the introductions. "Better than expected," I said honestly. River's pack felt different from the border community wolves I'd grown up around. More organized, more purposeful, but also more welcoming than I'd feared. They seem competent, Marcus. Finished. And loyal. That's good, you're going to need both. The evening finally wound down around 2 in the morning, with the pack members gradually dispersing to their own homes, scattered throughout the territory. Luna showed us to rooms in the pack house itself, apparently. Honored guests stayed close to the alpha rather than in the general population. "Your room is just down the hall from River's," she explained as we climbed the stairs to the second floor. "Marcus, you're across the hall. If you need anything during the night, don't hesitate to ask." My room was comfortable and welcoming, with a large bed covered in handmade quilts and windows that looked out over the forest. Someone had thoughtfully provided fresh towels and basic toiletries, along with a selection of books on werewolf history and supernatural abilities. "They're trying to make you feel at home," Marcus observed, setting my bags on the dresser. "It's working," I admitted. "This feels more welcoming than I expected." Marcus was quiet for a moment, staring out the window at the moonlit forest. "Naya, are you sure about this? About staying here? About trusting River? Because once you start training with them, once you begin to understand your abilities, there's no going back to the way things were." He was right, of course. The moment I'd accepted River's offer, I'd committed to a path that would fundamentally change who I was and how I related to the supernatural world. But the alternative containment by the council, or endless running from packs who wanted to use my abilities, was even less appealing. "I'm sure," I said. "Or as sure as I can be, given the circumstances. River's pack feels right, in a way I can't explain. And David seems like he actually knows what he's talking about when it comes to unusual abilities." Marcus nodded reluctantly. "Just promise me you'll be careful. Not just with your power, but with your heart. The connection you have with River, that kind of intensity, can cloud judgment." "I'll be careful," I promised, though we both knew that careful might not be enough when dealing with forces neither of us fully understood. After Marcus left for his own room, I found myself alone for the first time since the morning's revelations. The silence was welcome, giving me space to process everything that had happened and try to make sense of my new reality. I was a true alpha. The phrase still felt foreign, like something that belonged to someone else entirely. But I couldn't deny what had happened during that power surge. Couldn't ignore the way every wolf in the room had responded to whatever had awakened inside me. A soft knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. "It's River," came the quiet voice from the hallway. "May I come in?" I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt. Gone was the formal alpha attire from the council meeting, replaced by clothing that made him seem more approachable, more human. "I wanted to check on you," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Today was intense, and I know you're probably processing a lot." "That's an understatement," I said, stepping back to let him into the room. "This morning, I thought my biggest problem was avoiding council containment. Now I'm apparently some kind of legendary figure with world-changing potential." River closed the door behind him and moved to sit in the room's single chair, leaving the bed for me. It was a small courtesy, but one that I appreciated. He was being careful not to crowd me or make assumptions about the nature of our connection. "How are you handling it?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I admitted, settling cross-legged on the bed. "Part of me feels like I should be more overwhelmed than I am. Like discovering you're something out of legend should be more shocking. But mostly I just feel relieved, I think." Relieved? For the first time in my life, there's an explanation for why I'm different. Not just different, but different in a way that has meaning and purpose. I looked at him directly, trying to gauge his reaction, though I'm still not entirely sure I believe it. True alpha. Sounds like something from fairy tales. River was quiet for a moment, studying my face with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. What happened between us today when your power awakened that wasn't fairy tale magic. That was real, and it was unlike anything I've ever experienced. "What did it feel like?" I asked. "From your perspective, I mean. I know what I experienced, but I'm curious about your side of the connection." "Like coming home," River said simply. "Like finding something I'd been looking for my entire life without knowing I was searching for it." He paused, then added more carefully, "I don't want to pressure you or make assumptions about what that means, but I think we need to acknowledge that there's something significant happening between us." He was right, though the admission made me nervous. The attraction I felt toward River was unlike anything I'd experienced before. No, just physical, though that was certainly present, but something deeper and more fundamental, like recognition at a cellular level. "The mate bond you mentioned earlier," I said. "How would we know for certain?" "Time and proximity, mostly," River replied. "Mate bonds develop over weeks or months of interaction. If we are mates, the connection will strengthen and stabilize. If we're not, it will fade or normalize into something more manageable. And in the meantime?" River's smile was rueful. "In the meantime, we try to maintain appropriate boundaries while working together to understand your abilities, which is going to be challenging, given that physical proximity seems to intensify whatever's happening between us." It was a practical approach, one that acknowledged the complications without ignoring them entirely. I could work with practical. "Speaking of my abilities," I said, "what should I expect from tomorrow's training?" "David will start with basic assessment meditation exercises to help you sense and map your internal power, breathing techniques to help you maintain control during stressful situations, that sort of thing." River's expression grew more serious. "But Naya, I need you to understand that we're essentially making this up as we go along. David's experience with unusual abilities will help, but true alpha power is in a category by itself." "Meaning?" "Meaning we don't know what your limits are, or what might trigger another surge like the one today. We'll need to be very careful, very gradual in how we approach your development." The caution in his voice was warranted, given that my last power manifestation had knocked a room full of experienced wolves to their knees. But the idea of proceeding slowly, of potentially taking years to understand my abilities, was frustrating. "What if other packs don't give us time to be gradual?" I asked. "You said yourself that word is already spreading. How long before someone decides to test me?" River's expression darkened. "Not long enough, which is why we'll also be working on defensive techniques and emergency protocols. If someone does challenge you before you're ready, you need to know how to protect yourself." "Challenge me how?" "Formal combat, usually. One-on-one fights to establish dominance and hierarchy." River's tone was grim. True alphas, throughout history, have faced constant challenges from other wolves trying to prove themselves or claim power. It's an unfortunate aspect of supernatural politics. The idea of fighting other werewolves was terrifying, especially since I still couldn't shift into wolf form. How was I supposed to defend myself against challengers who could access their full supernatural abilities when I could barely control mine? River, I said carefully, what happens if I can't learn to shift? If my wolf remains locked away somehow? Then we'll figure out how to help you fight in human form, River said without hesitation. True alpha power isn't dependent on physical transformation. It's about commanding the respect and obedience of other wolves through sheer force of will and spiritual authority. That's not very reassuring when the other guy has claws and fangs. River's smile was sharp and predatory. Then we'll make sure you have other advantages. Enhanced reflexes, supernatural strength, maybe some weapons training. Whatever it takes to keep you safe. His protectiveness was both touching and concerning. I appreciated his willingness to help, but I didn't want to become dependent on others for my safety. If I was really a true alpha, I needed to be able to stand on my own. I should let you get some rest, River said, rising from the chair. Tomorrow is going to be a long day, and you need sleep. He was right, though I wasn't sure how well I'd sleep with everything that had happened churning through my mind. But as he moved toward the door, I found myself reluctant to let him leave. River, I called softly, and he turned back to me. Thank you for believing in me, for offering sanctuary, for everything. I know this isn't easy for you either. Something shifted in his expression, becoming warmer and more personal. Naya, having you here isn't a burden. It's... He paused, searching for words. It's the most right thing that's happened to me in a very long time. After he left, I found myself staring at the closed door for several minutes, my heart racing from the intensity in his voice. Whatever was developing between us, it was moving faster than was probably wise given the circumstances. But as I finally settled into bed and closed my eyes, I couldn't deny the sense of anticipation building in my chest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and revelations, new tests of abilities I was only beginning to understand. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I woke before dawn to the sound of wolves howling in the distance, their voices carrying through the mountain air in harmonies that spoke of pack unity and territorial pride. For a moment, I lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to sounds I'd never be able to make, feeling the familiar pang of exclusion that had marked my entire life. But today, that exclusion felt different somehow. Less like a failing and more like a postponement. If River and David were right about my nature, then my inability to shift wasn't a permanent condition. It was a protective mechanism that had served its purpose and would eventually be overcome. A soft knock on my door interrupted my morning musings. Naya? Luna's voice called from the hallway. David would like to start your assessment after breakfast, if you're ready. I'll be down in 15 minutes, I called back, forcing myself out of the comfortable bed and into the day ahead. The pack house was already bustling with activity when I made it downstairs, wolves coming and going as they prepared for their daily responsibilities. The atmosphere was welcoming but purposeful, and I got the sense that River ran a tight ship when it came to pack organisation. Marcus was already in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and chatting with a young woman who introduced herself as Sarah, one of the pack's newer members. They looked comfortable together, and I was relieved to see that he was settling in well, despite his concerns about pack dynamics. "How did you sleep?" he asked as I joined them at the large wooden table that dominated the room. "Better than expected," I said honestly, though I'm still processing everything that happened yesterday. David appeared in the doorway, carrying what looked like a medical bag and several electronic devices I didn't recognize. "Good morning, Naya. I hope you don't mind, but I'd like to start with some basic physiological measurements before we move on to the more esoteric assessments." "What kind of measurements?" A, Bay? I asked, though I'd expected something like this after yesterday's council testing. "Heart rate, blood pressure, brainwave patterns, things that might help us understand how your abilities affect your physical systems," David explained. "Nothing invasive, just baseline data to help guide our training approach." It seemed reasonable, and I was curious about the results myself. If true alpha power was as significant as everyone claimed, it should show up somehow in my biology. We set up in River's study, a comfortable room lined with books on pack management and supernatural lore. David's equipment was more sophisticated than Dr. Chen's had been, and he worked with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. "Interesting," he murmured as he reviewed the initial readings. "Your baseline readings are within normal human ranges, but there are some unusual patterns in your brain activity." "What kind of patterns?" I asked. "Arias associated with psychic ability and supernatural awareness are showing elevated activity even in your resting state," David explained. "It's like your brain is constantly processing information that most people can't perceive." That made sense, given my enhanced hearing and ability to sense other wolves' emotional states. But it also suggested that my abilities were more extensive than I'd realized. "What else can you tell from the readings?" I asked. David studied the data for several more minutes before responding. "Your nervous system shows signs of chronic low-level stress, which is consistent with someone whose abilities have been suppressed or constrained for an extended period. But there's also evidence of significant untapped potential neural pathways that exist but aren't being fully utilized." "The suppressed abilities," I said. "Is there a way to access them safely?" "That's what we're going to find out," David said. "But first, I want to try some meditation exercises to help you map your internal power structure. Understanding what you have access to is the first step toward learning to control it." The meditation was unlike anything I'd done before. David guided me through breathing exercises designed to quiet my conscious mind and allow my supernatural senses to come forward. At first, nothing happened, just the familiar sounds and scents of the pack house around us. But gradually, I began to perceive something else. A warm presence in my chest that felt vast and deep, like an ocean of power that I'd only been skimming the surface of. As my awareness focused on that presence, it stirred slightly, sending ripples of energy through my system. "Easy," David said quietly, though I hadn't realized he was monitoring my vital signs. "Don't try to force anything. Just observe and catalogue what you're sensing." The power in my chest felt ancient and patient, like something that had been waiting for a very long time. As I examined it more closely, I began to sense layers, different types of energy that seemed to serve different purposes. Some felt protective, others more aggressive. Some were clearly meant for communication, while others seemed designed for command and control. It's like a toolkit, I said softly, not wanting to lose the connection. Different abilities for different situations. Can you identify any specific functions? David asked. I focused more intently, trying to separate the various energy signatures I was sensing. Enhancement, that's what I'd been doing unconsciously with other wolves. Communication, I think I could speak directly to other wolves' minds if I knew how. Protection, some kind of shielding ability. And I paused, sensing something that felt both powerful and dangerous. Dominance. Raw authority that could compel obedience. That last one, David said carefully. That's probably what manifested yesterday when you dropped everyone to their knees. It's also the most dangerous ability for you to experiment with. Why? Because once other wolves experience that level of compulsion from you, they'll either submit completely or fight to the death rather than be controlled again, David explained. Dominance displays of that magnitude tend to eliminate middle ground in supernatural relationships. That was sobering. I'd thought yesterday's power surge had been impressive, but apparently it had also been politically catastrophic. Every wolf who'd witnessed it would now see me as either an absolute authority figure or a mortal threat. How do I avoid triggering it? Accidentally? I asked. Practice and control, David said. We'll work on exercises to help you access specific abilities without triggering others. It's going to take time and patience, but it's definitely possible. We spent the next several hours working through various control exercises, some successful and others less so. I managed to consciously access the enhancement ability, sending a small surge of power toward David that left him looking startled and energized. The communication ability proved more elusive, though I caught brief flickers of David's thoughts during our practice sessions. The protection ability was easier to trigger but harder to control. Several times during our practice, I found myself surrounded by what felt like a bubble of energy that made the air shimmer slightly. David's instruments went wild during these episodes, registering energy levels that shouldn't have been possible for a human-sized being to generate. That's enough for today, David finally said, as the afternoon sun began to slant through the study windows. You've made excellent progress, but I don't want to risk exhaustion or system overload. I was indeed tired, though not in the physically drained way I'd experienced after previous encounters with alphas. This was more like the satisfying fatigue, but came after a good workout, the sense of having pushed my limits without exceeding them. What's next? I asked as David packed up his equipment. Tomorrow we'll work on accessing your abilities under stress conditions, he said. Controlled stress, he added quickly, seeing my expression. But if you're going to face challenges from other wolves, you need to know that you can access your power even when you're frightened or angry. That made sense, though the idea of deliberately inducing stress was not appealing. But if other packs were already taking interest in my existence, I needed to be prepared for confrontation. David, I said as he prepared to leave, the other cases you mentioned, the psychic wolves and elemental shifters, how did they turn out? Were you able to help them? David's expression grew thoughtful. Most of them, yes. Though the adjustment period was challenging for everyone involved. Supernatural abilities that manifest later in life or remain dormant for extended periods can be difficult to integrate into someone's existing sense of self. Meaning that discovering you have significant power can be as traumatic as it is liberating, David said gently. Your entire understanding of who you are and where you fit in the world is going to change as you develop these abilities. That's normal, but it's also something we'll need to monitor carefully. It was a warning I appreciated, even if I wasn't sure how to prepare for an identity crisis. Everything I'd believed about myself had already been turned upside down in the past 24 hours. How much more change could one person handle? After David left, I found myself alone in River's study, surrounded by books on topics I'd never had reason to care about before. Pack law, territorial disputes, supernatural politics subjects that were rapidly becoming relevant to my life, whether I wanted them to be or not. I was browsing through a text on true alpha historical accounts when River appeared in the doorway, looking slightly windblown and carrying the scent of forest and fresh air. "How did the assessment go?" he asked, settling into the chair across from where I sat curled up on the leather couch. "Better than I expected," I said, closing the book and giving him my full attention. "David thinks I have access to at least 4 distinct abilities, though controlling them is going to take practice." "4 abilities?" River's eyebrows rose. "That's significant. Most wolves have access to 1 or 2 supernatural gifts beyond basic shapeshifting. Enhanced reflexes and strength don't count as separate abilities." I asked. "Those are considered baseline werewolf traits," River explained. What David identified sounds more like specialized psychic or magical capabilities. The distinction felt important, though I wasn't entirely sure why. But before I could ask the clarification, River's expression grew more serious. "Naya, I need to tell you something. I received word this afternoon that 3 different packs have requested formal meetings with us over the next 2 weeks. My stomach sank. "Challenge meetings?" "Not necessarily," River said carefully. "But the requests came from older, more established packs who don't typically seek social visits with newer territories. They're curious about you, and they want to assess the situation firsthand." "Which packs?" I asked, though I wasn't sure the names would mean anything to me. "The Redwood Coast Pack from Northern California, the Great Lakes Alliance from Michigan, and the Mountain Shadow Pack from Colorado," River listed. "All of them have significant political influence in the council, and all of them have produced multiple alpha bloodlines over the generations." None of the names were familiar, but the way River spoke about them made it clear they were major players in werewolf politics. "What do they want, really?" "To determine whether you're a genuine true alpha or an elaborate hoax," River said bluntly. "And if you are genuine, to figure out whether you're an asset to be courted or a threat to be neutralized." The casual way he mentioned neutralization made my blood run cold. "You mean they might try to kill me?" "It's possible," River admitted. "True alphas historically have faced assassination attempts from wolves who felt threatened by their power. But more likely, they'll try to discredit you publicly or find ways to limit your influence." "How would they do that?" River was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "By proving that you can't access your abilities reliably, or that you lack the political sophistication to use them effectively. If they can demonstrate that you're essentially a powerful but untrained anomaly, they can justify treating you as a curiosity rather than a legitimate leader. And if they can't, then they'll either try to recruit you to their own agendas or eliminate you as a competitor," River said grimly. "Supernatural politics aren't known for their subtlety." The weight of what I'd gotten myself into was starting to settle over me like a heavy blanket. I'd thought the council's containment facility was the worst-case scenario, but apparently there were much more unpleasant possibilities awaiting a true alpha who couldn't defend herself. "When is the first meeting?" I asked. "Next week. The Redwood Coast Pack is sending a delegation to pay their respects and discuss potential alliance opportunities." River's tone made it clear what he thought of their stated intentions. "And what's the real agenda?" "To test you," River said simply. "They'll push your boundaries, challenge your authority, and see how you respond under pressure. If you react like an untrained civilian, they'll know you're not ready for the responsibilities that come with true alpha status. And if I react like someone who knows what she's doing?" River's smile was sharp and predatory. "Then they'll know you're a threat to be taken seriously." Either option seemed fraught with complications, though I supposed being taken seriously was preferable to being dismissed as harmless. But the idea of having to perform for a group of political wolves while still figuring out my own abilities was daunting. "Will you be there?" I asked. "During the meeting, I mean." "Every step of the way," River said firmly. "These meetings are supposed to be conducted on neutral ground with appropriate witnesses. They can't try anything too overt with my pack providing security." That was reassuring, though I suspected that wolves with political ambitions could be dangerous in subtle ways as well as obvious ones. "What should I expect from them? What kinds of tests or challenges?" "Verbal sparring mostly. They'll try to provoke emotional responses, question your legitimacy, maybe share stories about previous true alphas that are designed to intimidate you." River paused, then added, "They might also try to trigger your power inadvertently to see how much control you have over it." "How would they do that?" "By bringing their own dominant wolves and creating situations designed to activate your enhancement or dominance abilities," River explained. "If you respond inappropriately either too weakly or too strongly, they'll use that as evidence that you're not ready for true alpha responsibilities." The more I learned about supernatural politics, the less I liked them. Everything seemed designed to trap the unwary or inexperienced, with serious consequences for making the wrong choice. "Is there any way to prepare for something like that?" "David's stress training will help," River said. "But mostly, you'll need to trust your instincts, and remember that you don't have to prove anything to them. You are what you are, regardless of their opinions." "Easy for you to say," I muttered. "You're not the one who has to convince a room full of skeptical alphas that you deserve to exist." River's expression softened. "Naya, you don't have to convince anyone of anything. True alpha status isn't something that's granted by committee, it's something you either are, aren't. What these packs are really trying to determine is how much influence you're going to have over supernatural politics going forward, and how much of a threat I represent to their existing power structures." "Exactly," River confirmed. "Which brings me to something else we need to discuss. These meetings aren't just about you there, also about my pack's position in the regional hierarchy. By allying ourselves with you, we've made a significant political statement, but other packs are going to want to evaluate." I hadn't considered that angle, but it made sense. River's relatively new pack would normally be considered minor players in supernatural politics, but harboring a true alpha changed their status considerably, for better or worse. "Are you having second thoughts?" I asked carefully. "About the alliance, I mean. Because if this is going to cause more problems for your pack than benefits." "No second thoughts," River said firmly. "But I wanted you to understand that the politics surrounding your emergence are going to affect everyone in my territory. My pack members are prepared for that, but it's something you should be aware of. The responsibility was overwhelming. Not only did I have to figure out abilities I didn't understand and face challenges from hostile wolves, but I also had to consider how my decisions would affect an entire pack of people who'd offered me sanctuary. "River," I said quietly, "what if I'm not strong enough for this? What if I can't live up to what everyone expects from a true alpha?" River moved from his chair to sit beside me on the couch, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Then we'll figure it out together. But Naya, what happened yesterday, the power you manifested? The way you handled the council assessment, that wasn't the behavior of someone who's too weak for responsibility. That was someone rising to meet a challenge. His confidence in me was both comforting and terrifying. I wanted to believe that I could handle whatever came next, but the gap between wanting and achieving felt enormous. "There's something else," River said, his tone shifting to something more personal. "The connection between us, it's getting stronger. I can feel your emotional state from anywhere in the pack house, and I suspect you're picking up on mine as well." He was right. Over the past 24 hours, I'd become increasingly aware of River's presence, even when he wasn't in the same room. His mood seemed to resonate through whatever bond was forming between us, creating a background awareness that was both intimate and unsettling. "Is that normal for mate bonds?" I asked. "For true alpha mate bonds, yes," River said carefully. "The connections tend to be more intense and develop more quickly than typical werewolf pairings. And if we're not actually mates, if this is just some kind of power compatibility..." River was quiet for a moment, and I could feel something complex and conflicted through our growing connection. "Then we'll need to be very careful about boundaries. Power-based connections can be just as consuming as romantic ones, but without the emotional foundation to make them sustainable." It was a sobering thought. The pull I felt toward River was growing stronger daily, but I couldn't tell how much of it was genuine attraction and how much was supernatural compatibility. The idea of building a relationship on a foundation that might be purely magical was troubling. "How do we tell the difference?" I asked. "Time," River said simply. "And honesty about what we're feeling and why. If the connection is purely power-based, it should stabilize once you gain better control over your abilities. And if it's something more..." River's gaze met mine, and I saw heat there that had nothing to do with supernatural power. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens." The promise in his voice made my pulse quicken, but before I could respond, the sound of raised voices from the main floor interrupted us. River tensed, his head tilting as he listened to something I couldn't quite make out. "What is it?" I asked. "Unexpected visitors," River said grimly, rising to his feet. "3 wolves I don't recognize, requesting immediate audience with you." My stomach dropped. "Already? I thought we had more time before the formal meetings." "So did I," River said, moving toward the door. "But it seems that word of your emergence has spread faster than we anticipated." I followed him downstairs, my heart racing as I tried to prepare myself for whatever was waiting. The main floor of the pack house was tense, with barely contained energy. Pack members positioned strategically around the room while maintaining the appearance of casual activity. Luna stood near the front door, her posture suggesting she was ready for trouble despite her calm expression. Through the windows, I could see 3 figures waiting on the front porch, all of them, radiating the kind of supernatural authority that marked dominant wolves. "What do they want?" I asked quietly. "To pay their respects to the new true alpha," Luna said, her tone making it clear what she thought of their stated intentions. "They're not from any of the packs that requested formal meetings," which meant they were either acting independently or representing interests that hadn't revealed themselves yet. Neither possibility was particularly comforting. "Let them in," River said after a moment's consideration. "But make it clear that this is a courtesy visit, not a formal negotiation." Luna nodded and opened the front door, stepping back to allow the 3 visitors to enter. They moved with the predatory grace common to all werewolves, but there was something different about the man, edge of barely contained violence, that made my skin prickle with warning. The leader was a woman in her 40s, with steel-grey hair and eyes like chips of ice. Her companions flanked her slightly, both men who looked like they'd be more comfortable in a fight than a formal meeting. "Alpha Stone," the woman said, offering a nod that managed to be both respectful and dismissive. "Thank you for receiving us on such short notice. I'm Victoria Cross of the Northern Territories Independent Coalition." I'd never heard of the organization, but River's slight tensing suggested it was significant. "Ms. Cross," he replied carefully. "What brings you to my territory?" Victoria's gaze shifted to me, and I felt the full weight of her assessment, like a physical pressure. "We've come to meet the young woman who's been making such waves in supernatural politics, to determine whether the rumors about her abilities are accurate. And what rumors would those be?" I asked, stepping forward slightly. If this was going to be a test of some kind, I might as well face it directly. Victoria smiled, and there was nothing warm about the expression. "That a previously unknown werewolf has manifested true alpha abilities without proper training or lineage verification. Such claims require investigation." The way she said investigation made it clear that she was questioning not just my abilities, but my right to exist. It was a challenge disguised as concern, and I could feel my power stirring in response to the implied threat. "I'm not sure what kind of investigation you had in mind," River said smoothly, "but formal assessments of true alpha candidates are handled by the Council, not by independent coalitions." "Of course," Victoria agreed. "We're simply interested in meeting the person who's caused such a stir. Surely there's no harm in a brief conversation." It was phrased as a question, but her tone made it clear that refusing would be seen as a sign of weakness. I could feel the political trap closing around us agree to their conversation, and risk whatever tests they had planned, or refuse and be branded as hiding something. "A brief conversation would be fine," I said before River could object. "Though I should mention that I'm still learning to control my abilities. There might be some unexpected effects." It was a warning disguised as disclosure, and I saw Victoria's eyes narrow slightly as she processed the implications. If I was genuinely a true alpha whose power was unstable, getting too close could be dangerous for her and her companions. "We appreciate the warning," Victoria said, though her smile suggested she thought she could handle whatever I might manifest. "Perhaps we could sit and discuss your background? I'm particularly interested in your family lineage." We moved to the pack house's formal sitting area, everyone taking seats that allowed for quick movement if things went wrong. I could feel the tension in the room like a live wire, every pack member ready to respond to the first sign of aggression. "So," Victoria began once we were settled, You claim to be a true alpha, despite never having shifted and with no documented supernatural lineage. That's quite unusual. I don't claim to be anything. I said carefully. But the evidence suggests that's what I am, regardless of how unusual it might be. Evidence, one of Victoria's companions repeated, speaking for the first time. What evidence would that be? Before I could answer, I felt River's power spike, slightly not enough to be threatening, but enough to be noticeable. It was meant as a demonstration, I realized, to show these visitors what happened when an alpha was near me. The effect was immediate and obvious. River's already considerable presence intensified dramatically, his supernatural authority filling the room like a physical force. Victoria and her companions tensed, their own wolves responding instinctively to the enhanced dominance radiating from him. Interesting, Victoria said, though her voice was strained. You enhance other wolves' abilities, but enhancement isn't the same as true alpha power. She was right, and we all knew it. The enhancement ability was impressive, but it wasn't enough to prove my status as anything more than an unusual anomaly. If I wanted to convince these wolves that I was genuine, I was going to need to access something more significant. The problem was that my more dramatic abilities seemed to trigger involuntarily, usually in response to stress or strong emotion. I couldn't just decide to manifest true alpha dominance the way other wolves could shift or extend their claws. You're right, I said, making a decision that was probably going to have serious consequences. Enhancement alone isn't proof of anything. I closed my eyes and reached for the power David had helped me map earlier, specifically looking for the dominance ability that had dropped everyone to their knees during the council assessment. It felt dangerous and wild, like trying to grasp lightning, but I managed to touch the edge of it. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Authority exploded outward from me in waves, filling the room with primal power that spoke directly to the wolf nature of everyone present. I felt, rather than saw, Victoria and her companions drop to their knees, their human consciousness overwhelmed by instincts that recognized an apex predator when they encountered one. Even River, who'd experienced this before, struggled to remain upright under the assault of pure alpha dominance. His pack members throughout the house responded with similar submission, though I could sense their reactions were more willing than those of our uninvited guests. I held the manifestation for perhaps 10 seconds before releasing it, the sudden absence of power leaving everyone gasping and shaken. Victoria was the last to recover, pushing herself back to her feet with obvious effort and fury. That, she said through gritted teeth, was unnecessary. You asked for evidence, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded despite the fact that my hands were shaking. I provided it. Victoria's expression was a mix of rage and grudging respect. She'd gotten the demonstration she'd come for, but it had cost her considerably in terms of dignity and political positioning. Being forced to submit in front of witnesses was not something an alpha forgot easily. Your power is significant, she admitted, but power without wisdom is dangerous. How do we know you won't use those abilities irresponsibly? You don't, I said honestly. But then again, I don't know that you won't use your position to hurt innocent people either. Trust has to be earned on both sides. Victoria studied me for a long moment, and I got the sense that she was reassessing her initial assumptions about me. Whatever she'd expected to find a frightened girl with uncontrolled abilities, perhaps he wasn't matching the profile. "The Northern Territories Coalition will be watching your development with great interest," she said finally. "We hope that your emergence proves beneficial for the supernatural community as a whole." It was a diplomatic way of saying that they'd be monitoring me for signs of becoming a threat, but I supposed that was preferable to open hostility. At least for now. "I hope so too," I said. "Though I suspect that will depend largely on how others choose to respond to my existence." Victoria's smile was sharp and knowing. "Indeed. Come, gentlemen," she said to her companions. "We've learned what we came to learn." They left as abruptly as they'd arrived, taking with them the oppressive tension that had filled the pack house since their arrival. I waited until I was sure they were gone, before finally allowing myself to collapse back onto the couch, exhaustion hitting me like a physical blow. "Well," River said after a moment, "that could have gone worse." "How?" I asked, weakly. "I just made enemies of an entire supernatural coalition. You proved that you're not someone to be dismissed or underestimated," River corrected. "And you handled the political pressure better than most wolves would have in your position." Marcus appeared at my elbow with a glass of water, which I accepted gratefully. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. "That power display looked like it took a lot out of you." "I'm fine," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. Using the dominance ability deliberately had been different from the involuntary manifestations, more controlled, but also more draining. "Just tired." "That's normal," David said, emerging from wherever he'd been observing the confrontation. Deliberate power manifestation requires significantly more energy than involuntary responses. You'll build stamina with practice. "Good to know," I said. "Though I hope I won't need to do that very often." "You will," River said grimly. What just happened, Werewolf showing up unannounced? To test you, that's going to become a regular occurrence, until word spreads that you're genuine and not to be trifled with. The idea of facing regular challenges like this was exhausting, but I supposed it was preferable to being locked away in a council facility. At least this way, I had some control over how the encounters unfolded. "How many more groups like Victoria's Coalition are out there?" I asked. "Dozens," River said. "Independent packs, regional alliances, specialized organizations, the supernatural community is more fragmented than most people realize, and now they're all going to want to assess you personally." "Wonderful," I muttered. "Anything else I should know about the political landscape I've stumbled into?" River and David exchanged a look that suggested there was considerably more complexity involved than they'd shared so far. "There are some other supernatural species that might take an interest in your emergence," David said carefully. "Vampires, fey courts, various magical practitioners. True alphas historically have influenced more than just werewolf politics. Meaning that your existence might trigger changes in multiple power. Supernatural communities," River explained. "Not all of them positive from our perspective." The scope of what I'd gotten myself into was becoming clearer, and it was considerably more vast and complicated than I'd imagined. I'd thought I was dealing with werewolf pack politics, but apparently my emergence as a true alpha had implications for the entire hidden supernatural world. "One crisis at a time," I said finally. "Right now, Let's focus on preparing for next week's formal meeting with the Redwood Coast Pack. Everything else can wait until I have a better handle on my abilities." River nodded, though I could feel his concern through our growing connection. "Agreed. But Naya, I want you to understand something. What happened here today, the way you handled Victoria's challenge, that was impressive. You're stronger than you realize." His confidence in me was reassuring, though I suspected the real tests were still ahead. Victoria's coalition had been fishing for information, but the formal pack meetings would be more serious affairs with higher stakes. "I hope you're right," I said, "because I have a feeling things are about to get a lot more complicated." As it turned out, I was completely correct. The next week passed in a blur of intensive training sessions with David, political briefings from River, and increasingly frequent surprise visits from various supernatural groups wanting to assess the new true alpha. Each encounter followed a similar pattern: polite requests for audience, subtle challenges to my authority, and carefully observed responses to my power manifestations. Some visitors were more aggressive than others, but all of them left with the clear understanding that I was not to be dismissed lightly. The constant testing was exhausting, but it was also educational. I learned to recognize the subtle verbal traps that supernatural politicians favored, to distinguish between genuine curiosity and hostile investigation, and to project confidence even when I felt overwhelmed by the responsibilities being thrust upon me. More importantly, I was gaining better control over my abilities. The daily practice sessions with David were paying off. He could now access specific powers deliberately rather than relying on involuntary responses. And I was beginning to understand the complex interplay between different types of supernatural energy. The enhancement ability was becoming second nature, allowing me to boost other wolves' capabilities with minimal effort. The protection ability was more challenging but increasingly reliable, surrounding me with defensive energy whenever I felt threatened. Communication remained elusive, though I occasionally caught flashes of others' thoughts during moments of high emotion. The dominance ability remained the most powerful and the most dangerous. Each time I accessed it deliberately, the effect seemed to grow stronger, as if the power was becoming more fully awakened with use. But it also left me more drained afterward, and I was beginning to understand why true alphas throughout history had needed careful management of their abilities. "You're making excellent progress," David said on the morning of the Redwood Coast Pack meeting. "Your control has improved dramatically, and your power output is becoming more consistent. Consistent enough to handle whatever they throw at me today?" I asked. "I believe so," David said. "Though remember, the goal isn't to prove your strength through displays of power. The goal is to demonstrate that you're in control of your abilities and capable of making sound political decisions." It was advice I'd heard repeatedly over the past week, but it was worth repeating. Supernatural politics seemed to reward measured responses over dramatic gestures, at least when dealing with established power structures. The Redwood Coast Pack delegation arrived precisely at noon, their convoy of black SUVs pulling up to the pack house with military precision. Through the window, I could see 6 figures emerging from the vehicles, all of them carrying themselves with the unmistakable authority of dominant wolves. "Showtime," River said quietly, moving to stand beside me. "Remember, you don't have to prove anything to them. Just be yourself." "That's what I'm afraid of," I muttered, but I straightened my shoulders and prepared to face whatever came next. The Redwood Coast Pack had sent their best and most experienced representatives, led by an alpha named Catherine Blackwood, who'd apparently been managing supernatural politics since before I was born. She was accompanied by her beta, 2 enforcers, and 2 younger wolves, who were probably being groomed for leadership positions. Alpha Blackwood, River said formally, as we gathered in the packhouse's main reception area. Welcome to Cascade Mountain Pack territory. Alpha Stone, Catherine replied, with a nod that managed to convey both respect and assessment. Thank you for hosting us on such short notice. Her gaze moved to me, and I felt the full weight of decades of experience and authority focused in my direction. Catherine Blackwood was not someone who could be impressed by raw power. Alone she would be evaluating everything from my posture to my word choice for signs of competence or weakness. And you must be Naya Thorne, she said, offering her hand in greeting. I've heard quite a bit about you. I imagine you have, I replied, accepting the handshake and managing not to react when her power brushed against mine in a subtle test. Though I suspect much of what you've heard doesn't quite match the reality. Catherine's smile was approving. Reality rarely does. That's why we prefer to make our own assessments. We spent the next several hours in what could generously be called political conversation, and more accurately described as sophisticated interrogation. Catherine and her delegation asked probing questions about my background, my training, my understanding of true alpha responsibilities, and my plans for the future. Through it all, I tried to project the kind of measured confidence that David and River had coached me on. I answered questions honestly when possible, deflected gracefully when necessary, and gradually demonstrated that I understood the political implications of my existence, even if I was still learning to navigate them. Tell me about your enhancement abilities, Catherine said eventually. The reports suggest that you can significantly boost other wolves' capabilities. To some degree, yes, I said carefully. Though the effects vary depending on the individual and the circumstances. Would you be willing to provide a demonstration? One of her enforcers asked. We're curious about the practical applications. It was the moment I'd been dreading and preparing for. Demonstrating my abilities was risky too little power, and they'd think I was weak. Too much, and they'd see me as a threat to be eliminated. Of course, I said, looking at River for confirmation. Though I should mention that the effects can be unpredictable when working with unfamiliar wolves. River nodded his consent, and I reached carefully for the enhancement ability, directing a measured surge of power toward Catherine herself. The effect was immediate. Her already considerable presence intensified dramatically, filling the room with amplified alpha authority. But instead of being overwhelmed by the enhancement, Catherine seemed to absorb and channel it with practiced ease. Her control remained perfect throughout the demonstration, and when I withdrew the power boost, she looked more energized than drained. Impressive, she said, and I could tell she meant it. The effect is considerably more sophisticated than simple power amplification. You're actually awakening dormant potential rather than adding external energy. It was a distinction I hadn't fully understood myself, but Catherine's explanation made sense of something that had been puzzling me about my abilities. I wasn't giving other wolves borrowed power. I was helping them access capabilities they already possessed but couldn't reach on their own. Is that significant? I asked. Very, Catherine replied. It suggests that your abilities are more fundamental to werewolf nature than we initially assumed, true alpha power has always been described as awakening the potential in others rather than dominating them. The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics ranging from supernatural lore to pack management philosophy. Catherine's delegation was clearly testing my knowledge and understanding of complex issues, but they were also sharing information that I found genuinely useful. By the time they prepared to leave, I felt like I'd passed some kind of examination, though I wasn't entirely sure what the grading criteria had been. "Miss Thorne," Catherine said, as they gathered their belongings, "I want you to know that the Redwood Coast Pack will be supporting your recognition as a legitimate true alpha when the matter comes before the council." It was more than I dared hope for, and the relief I felt was probably visible on my face. "Thank you. That means more than you know. Just remember," Catherine added, "with recognition comes responsibility. The supernatural community will be watching to see how you use your abilities and influence. Don't disappoint us." After they left, I finally allowed myself to collapse into a chair, the tension of the past several hours leaving me feeling wrung out but victorious. "That went well," River said, settling beside me with obvious relief. "Catherine's support will carry significant weight with other pack leaders." "One down. How many to go?" I asked. "The Great Lakes Alliance meeting is tomorrow, and the Mountain Shadow Pack arrives day after that," River replied. "But after today's success, I'm optimistic about how those will go." I hoped he was right, though I suspected each pack would present their own unique challenges and expectations. But for now, I was content to bask in the glow of having successfully navigated my first formal supernatural political meeting. "River," I said as the adrenaline began to fade, "when this is all over, when I've proven myself to the various pack leaders and learned to control my abilities, what happens then?" River was quiet for a moment, and I could feel something complex moving through our connection. "Then you'll have choices to make about how you want to use your influence and where you want to make your home. And if I choose to stay here, with your pack," River's smile was warm and genuine, "then we'll figure out how to build something new together. True alphas don't follow traditional pack structures, they create their own." The possibility was both exciting and terrifying. I'd spent my entire life feeling like I didn't quite belong anywhere, and now I was being offered the chance to help create a place where I could truly fit. But first, I had to survive the remaining political meetings and prove that I was worthy of the power I'd never asked for. The game of supernatural politics was far from over, and the stakes were only getting higher. As evening settled over the Cascade Mountains, I found myself looking forward to whatever came next, with a mixture of anticipation and determination. I was no longer the broken werewolf who couldn't shift. I was becoming something new, something powerful, something that could reshape the supernatural world. The question now was whether that world was ready for me.